Hello, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is Aftermath of Murder, Survivor Stories, a multi-part video series produced in support of the National Victims of Crime Week. This series features exclusive interviews with ordinary people who have experienced an extraordinary event, the devastating loss of a loved one through murder. For most of us, our only experience with murder is vicarious, through fictional stories in film and television and via the real-life sensational details covered in the news. We're captivated by the grisly details of murder, the whodunit, and the court trial. Rarely do we get a full picture of the victim, and almost never any true understanding of the terrible emotional impact on the survivors of murder. Aftermath of Murder goes behind the headlines as survivors share their stories about the loss, grief, trauma, and the hope for healing in the aftermath of murder. Joining us today in studio is Sawkins, whose partner Tony Mcnaughton was murdered in January of 2000 while saving the life of a female employee. Tony was the manager of a Starbucks in downtown Vancouver and was stabbed by a disgruntled ex-husband who entered the coffee shop wielding a butcher knife to attack his ex-wife. Alan, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
So tell us a little bit more about Tony and that day.
Tony was in the store, in the staff area behind the counter, when his colleague ran in, being chased by her husband, estranged husband. Tony stepped into the doorway to say, "You can't come in here," at which the man punched him in the face and he fell over into a set of shelves, and as he stood back up, the man stabbed him with a butcher's knife. Now, they were blocking the doorway, so she wouldn't have been able to get out of the room. So as Tony collapsed, he held onto the man's jacket, pulled him down on top of him and held him on top of him whilst calling to her to escape. So she was able to jump over the bodies and out the door and get to safety. But unfortunately, Tony died of multiple stab wounds.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a hero.
Yes, he was claimed as a hero, yes.
He won an award?
Yeah, he was given the Governor General's Medal of Bravery and the Certificate of Merit from the Vancouver Police Department as well.
So describe to me on your side, what happened when you were told? Like, how were you told?
I was at home, and Tony's sister and brother-in-law and 2 children were staying with us. They were about to go home to Belfast that afternoon. Tony had changed his shift, so he would be able to take them to the airport. So he made sure he was working that morning. And the doorbell went just as I was about to take our dog for a walk, and it was the Vancouver Police Department, and they said they needed to come up. And I kind of figured they must have the wrong place, you know, and they came in and said, you know, "Are you Alan, Tony's partner?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "We think you better sit down, we have some bad news." And all I could think of was, what bad news could there be? He only worked, you know, 5 blocks away or whatever. And I sat down, and they said Tony was opening the store this morning with his colleague when her estranged husband came in, and unfortunately there was an altercation, and Tony was stabbed. And there was a very brief pause, and then he said, "And unfortunately he died." So, and that's, when that happens, it's like you're just thrust into a wall at 4 speed, you know, bang, and everything just stops. And, you know, your whole sense of what the world is changes in that moment. And there's this complete sense of disbelief. I always explain it as, it's almost like you step outside of your body and your spiritual body looks at the physical body wondering what's going on here, and your physical body just goes numb and you just have no idea what to do next.
And it must have started like a normal day, any other day.
Yeah, it did. The hard part for me is that Tony had a migraine that morning. And I had said to him, "Don't go to work." But he said, "I can't let my colleague open the shop on her own. I will go in, I'll open the store, and when it gets to a reasonable hour, I'll call another staff member to come in and take over, and then I will come home." And part of you thinks, if I could have stopped him from going to work that morning, this wouldn't have happened.
So it's guilt?
Yeah, you kind of feel, if only I could have stopped it. If only I'd made, you know, if I'd been more forceful rather than just letting him go to work. But it's what he was, you know, he was very diligent in his job. He was very conscientious, and he loved working for Starbucks, and he loved his job, and he always thought about his colleagues and his staff. And so, just that thought of, I'll wait till a reasonable hour and then call someone to come in, really was his whole mindset as the kind of person who he was.
That sense of guilt that you could have stopped it and you didn't, that must be a very integral aspect of the grieving process for you, working through that.
Well, it is, because even though you know it's illogical, you still go there. And so you need to find a way of making some rational sense of the fact that you couldn't have made a difference. One of the most important things that I learned was someone from the Victim Services of the Crown Council said to me, your problem is you will try to make sense of this, and that will drive you mad, because this is a senseless death. And when we try and make sense of homicide, you just go round and around and around, because there is no sense to it. Something completely out of the ordinary happened that could never have been anticipated.
Do you think because it's homicide and very much is an extraordinary event that happens, correct? Mm-hmm. Is there a different approach to working through it and the grief than, say, if it was an anticipatory loss of natural causes, say, for instance?
I think very, very different. I think, as someone, I lost both my parents, and I'd been around natural death many, many times. But what people, I think, don't appreciate is the energy attached to a violent death. Someone made a choice. Someone intentionally took that life. And for me, there's an energetic quality to that death that makes the grief very, very different. That's not like a natural death. And I think it isolates survivors of homicide, because there's so few people for us to share our story with. There's people who've had a natural death feel that they understand, but in many ways they don't, because this is an unnatural death in many ways.
When you said story, obviously your story was covered to quite a bit extent. It was very high profile on the news, was it not?
It was, yes. And I think that, once again, that's what makes the death different as well. You are suddenly thrown into the media wanting to know about your life and the victim's life. And so Tony being hailed as a hero by the chief of police, meant that everyone wanted to know something. And so I realised, and it was a choice I made, that if we were going to deal with the media, I wanted the focus to be on Tony and Tony's heroic action as opposed to my grief. So I made a choice not to be in the media. I basically asked a friend of mine to represent the family, and we wrote a press release and we organised photographs, because we didn't want the media going to find other people who might have sort of known Tony to get Tony's story. So it was very much, it sounds very weird, I suppose, but we kind of set my apartment up as like media HQ. We would have these meetings of how are we going to deal with the media tomorrow, and what should we give the media, what is appropriate, what isn't appropriate. And so that makes your grief even more unreal, because you're not dealing with your grief, you're actually dealing with all these practical aspects of dealing with the media.
Right.
And then wanting to know who you are as the partner, and his story. Did you feel like they were prying? Actually, I was very touched by the media. They didn't make me feel intimidated or pried into. And I think part of that was the fact that we had someone who would speak on our behalf, and we had a press release, and we had photographs, and we had things that we felt, I suppose in many ways, that we could control the media and how information was dissipated. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It actually sounds like to me that you feel that there was some benefit. It was a worthwhile experience.
For me, it was, and part of that came from a Buddhist term that we use, which is turn poison into medicine. That this horrendous thing that I could never possibly have imagined would have happened in my life how could I create some value from that? And part of me felt if I could work somehow with the media or control what was going to the media, I might be able to talk about principles of non-violence. I may be able to talk about domestic violence and use, as horrible as it may sound, use Tony's death as a way of trying to create some kind of change. Does that make sense?
I think it certainly does.
Yeah.
When we had talked prior to this interview on camera, you had mentioned that you thought that some people might feel isolated if they didn't get the media coverage.
And I think it's a double-edged sword because, you know, part of it is you do want people to know what has happened. Part of that is then you have a voice. And I fully understand why people might feel, why am I not in the media? Why has this story not made it? You know, it basically undermines you and it undermines the event. You know, a survivor of a homicide is dealing with an incredible amount of stuff which needs to be shared with other people so that the media understand, so that their colleagues at work understand, so that other family members, you know, extended family members may understand what's going on. And so I think, I fully understand why some people would feel, yeah, I feel there should have been more about my situation.
Tell me about your own personal steps on your journey through the process of dealing with the grief.
I think the hardest part for survivors is that you can't start grieving until there is some resolution at the end of the trial. So I was lucky by other standards in that the trial happened 16 months after Tony's death.
As opposed to a real
As
long
opposed
time.
to 5 years or 10 years or whatever. And in that time, you, because there is a trial, you don't know all the details of the death because it can compromise the case. So in your head, you create every possible scenario. And I wondered all the time what his death was like because I didn't know how or when it all came together. So then you have the trial, and you may have gone for grief counselling and you may have some idea of what's going on for you, but when you go to the trial, you are then completely re-traumatised. And I'm pretty certain it's the same for many survivors, is that we want to know the details. Because I want to know what happened, because then hopefully I can come to some understanding, I can make some strange sense of it all for me. But then I'm re-traumatised. So
you're choosing to re-traumatize yourself in some cases too, aren't you, by wanting those details?
Well, yes, but I think that's a natural reaction to a homicide survivor. We always ask why and what could we have done, and I need to understand this. And so, you know, I had some grief counselling prior to the trial and luckily was warned, you know, you will be re-traumatised when you go to the trial because you will hear everything in detail. You know.
What happened with the offender?
He was found guilty of first-degree murder, I believe, and given life imprisonment without parole for 15 years.
And recently he died of natural causes.
He died of natural causes.
How did you feel about that?
Once again, a very, very strange scenario, because on the one hand, there's this, okay, now I don't have to constantly be fighting for justice on Tony's behalf. Because that's what I did. I chose to be part of a system which informs you of the offender's movements, if they're applying for parole, all of those things. So I made that choice, but once again was re-traumatised every time I heard something, but my choice. So when he died, what I realised was I now have nothing to fight for. I don't have to fight for justice for Tony. What I have to do is actually still deal even more with the loss.
It's almost a finalization of the loss, isn't it?
Yeah, it's your last connection, my last connection to Tony, I suppose, in a very twisted way. So then it was like, there's stuff I need to resolve now that I thought I may have already resolved, but realised that the advocacy and fighting for things and channeling your energy into that sometimes takes you away from the loss itself.
Which might have been actually very important for your healing during that time.
Very much so.
But here you are 13 years later, still feeling the last of the loss.
Yeah, and I don't think it ever goes away. You know, I actually feel that what we do is we don't get over the grief, and time doesn't heal all wounds. A friend of mine's favourite phrase is that time makes the unbearable bearable. And I think that what happens is that the loss finds its place in your life, whereby it doesn't become so emotional, it doesn't overtake you, it doesn't stop you from functioning. But you carry it with you, you move forwards, and you take the memory and the love and all of those things with you. Because when that happens, it shapes who you are. It changes your life completely. I am a very different person now after Tony's death than I was prior to Tony's death. Lots of things change and shift for me, and so you become a very, very different person.
If you or someone you know has experienced a loss through homicide, go to the BC Victims of Homicide website at bcvoh.com to find available resources and information on upcoming support groups. If you're interested in volunteering or to make a donation, visit the BC Bereavement Helpline website. And to reach both by phone, call 604-738-9950 or toll free 1-877-779-2223. This has been Aftermath of Murder Survivor Stories.